you, Madam President.
Beautiful. All right, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. So on the call today, we have Barbara Howard and from Rockland Trust. And as you can see in this presentation she put forward, she is the Senior Vice President of Relationship Manager at Rockland Trust. And she has been before us before, back in August, and she's here again just to give another overview. There was a number of questions that came from the Finance Committee yesterday, as well as a couple of the members, and she has those questions and we can run through them once she is completed with the presentation. So Barbara, I'll be at the Vanna if you want to just prompt me through. Oh, Brian.
Excuse me.
Okay, thank you everyone for having us in. And as she mentioned, I'm Barbara Howard. I'm the relationship manager on. So I'm going to take you through the presentation, and as she mentioned, we do have some questions here. We're able to try and cover in 15 minutes. Provided Brian and I do plan on answering as we go through, hopefully answer most of these questions as we go through the presentation. So if we could turn to page 2, this is the relationship. I'll go through the OPEB planning steps, and then Brian will take you through the allocation and the performance, and then if time we'll also the market holding. So in this section you can see the account information. And the first thing I'm going to do is one of the questions you asked, that should you use another provider besides Rockland Trust, would there be a penalty if you were to move the funds? And the answer to that question is no, there would be no penalty to move the funds. So it's the money market account that was opened in 2000, that's strictly in a cash money market fund. And then what we're really going to go over tonight is the next account, which is your OPEB account. And so the investment objective is balanced, and Brian again will go over that. And then it was opened in 2012. I have provided some transaction detail there. I did send out further detail, which was another one of the questions, so I'm hoping that got out to you folks. If not, I'm sure they'll follow up with that. You can see the list of your authorized signers. Your auditors are Guider Hurley, and Odyssey Advisors are the ones that do your actuarial report for the OPEB fund. And you can see on the next section there are the fees, and all in, I've broken out how they're calculated, and given the current balance of February 20th, the fee was up to about 6 basis points. And before we flip the page, one of the other questions was, why is there that disclosure for not insured by FDIC? And that is because they're not products. You're invested actually in the capital markets, so there is no insurance on the funds. And so with that, if you can go turn to page 3, these are what we call our OPEB planning steps. So these are the various steps that we recommend that you take in order to establish your fund. So you adopt the language of law, chapter 32B, section 20 in 2010, and that establishes the fund. Any funds that are provided in or put into the account are segregated and not subject to the creditor's claims. The next step is to establish a formal trust agreement. That has not been completed, and we plan to work with you folks to get that done. Another one of the questions was, are the trustees your board? And I believe that that is the intent, that the board are considered the trustees of the OPEB trust as well. The next section there is your investment policy statement, which has been completed, and that was approved in 2016. And again, that's just a roadmap to let all of those involved in this fund, how you're going to manage the fund and the goals and objectives. The biggest part of an investment policy statement is the trustee risk. So as most of you can think about it, big swings in the market make people want to make most people think about when the markets go down. So when the markets go down, people want to rush out the door. But what people also forget is when the markets get frothy, as we say, or start rising, people want to get a little bit more risky. So an IPS basically tells you to just keep your foot on cruise control. The only time you should change your investment objective is if the objectives of the funds have changed. The next section there is your funding policy, and the actuaries are looking for something in writing. You folks have been very, very good as far as your funding and adding to this plan. So I have no complaints on that. The question is it in writing so the actuary looks at it? Is he taking in those deposits when he does the calculation of your discount rate? And then finally, the payments, and this was a question also, is how do we suggest that you use these funds? So basically our suggestion is what you're doing right now is what they call pay-as-you-go. In other words, you're not putting the funds that you're using to make any current payments into the fund and then turning around and withdrawing them. You're just making the payments. Most municipalities that we're working with right now have no intention of actually using these funds until it's actually fully funded. And then one of the other questions that sort of is in line with this is, what about if all of a sudden you had a lot of early retirements? Would that deplete the fund? And more than likely, yes, it would. But one of the things that you'll see is your actuary comes in and looks at this fund and does a report for you every 2 years. So if all of a sudden you saw a lot of early retirements, that would be factored into your discount rate and to what your funding should be. So again, that would be discussed with your actuary, and again, it's reported every 2 years. So with that,
I was going to say, do you want to just take a quick stop here? Did anybody have questions about any of these first 2 pages, this overview?
Mary, I do.
Go ahead, Sandy.
I'm sorry if now, and I'm sorry, Barbara, you were breaking up in the beginning, so it was difficult to hear what you were saying. As far as the not insured by the FDIC or any other government agency, so who are we insured by?
they're not insured. So basically when you invest in income, you're, the U.S. Treasuries, and so it's the backing of the bond issuers. And then again, you're in the stock market, so there is no insurance.
Yeah. So I'll jump in there, Barbara, help. Am I coming across? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Sorry, because I knew Barbara was a little choppy. Yeah. So the way to think of it is the government insures cash holdings in the bank, and everything that you invest in, it's essentially more aggressive, or the returns more than that is not guaranteed, or I would say it's guaranteed by the full faith and credit of that entity. Right now we have the different mutual funds in the portfolio. Those all own a collection of securities. So the bond funds own a collection of bonds, and the stock funds own a portfolio of stocks. And so each security within those portfolios, they're as good as the company that backs it. So if you think about we're investing in, say, Apple and Microsoft and Pepsi-Cola in different funds, those are backed by the companies themselves. And same thing with government securities. The government backs those, but every security that you own when you're invested in a portfolio that's that's meant to grow through long term is backed by the entity.
If I may, Brian, who is the entity then?
Sure. So it boils down to each company. So when I say in these mutual funds, a mutual fund will hold, or I can say, the BrightRock one that you own. So within that, there is about 45 different stocks. So as I mentioned, there's Microsoft, there's Pepsi, there's Sherwin-Williams, there's Home Depot. There's the names that we know in the economy, and those companies, they're not the companies essentially the earnings of those companies guarantee stocks. For when you're in a bond fund, it's the company saying we're going to pay you back. For government securities, it's the government says we are going to pay you back. But for them to get a governmental guarantee, they wouldn't allow you to get the upside of the capital appreciation of a stock or the dividends, right? And am I explaining that clearly enough, and I apologize.
Sandy?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, so essentially only at the cash level does the government guarantee your holdings at the bank? Once you, in right now, if we were all in cash holdings at the bank, we would be returning somewhere between 0.01 and probably 0.1 of a rate. And so what we're trying to do is we need to make what the actuary is trying to say that we're going to get through time. So we're trying to get, you know, more towards, you know, they essentially have us like 5.5%, 6%. We're trying to, the balance fund, get even higher than that. But in order to get 5%, we can't have cash holdings. So we have bond stock, funds, et cetera, in the portfolio, or funds and stocks and other assets inside of the funds that are in your portfolio.
Okay, and if I may continue.
No, by all means.
I don't want to take everybody's time. If anybody has any questions, please tell me. So the trustees and define the powers and the establishment of formal trust agreement. So I guess we discussed this a little bit last night about who is the trustee, and is that, I mean, from my understanding, is the trustee is the person or the agent, which would be the bank. And what are your powers? I would have liked to have seen something, you know, explaining a little bit more about that.
Sure. The bank is not the trustee of these funds. The Old Colony Planning Council is the trustee of them.
Okay, and so we maintain the powers of that.
Correct. So you maintain the powers to invest the funds, to distribute the funds, and to direct how they're invested.
And then by hiring Rockland Trust as investment manager, we carry the burden of fiduciary responsibility as well. So we at least share that, where a lot of places aren't, you know, you see in commercial aren't fiduciaries. So at least we are held to always act in the best interest of the investors of this fund.
Okay.
Carrying on the fiduciary status, we can't be trustee of the assets the state mandates that you are.
Okay. And you said there was no penalty in removing such funds?
Nope.
Correct.
And there's no penalty either? I wouldn't think so. I'm probably answering my own question. If somebody retired and started using the money, there wouldn't be any penalties in that?
No, all withdrawals and contributions come in, no fees. There's no like when we're transacting, there are no fees. That it's not a brokerage account or anything like that, by any means. And to that point, and Barbara elaborated on it some. The good part about this roadmap is that the actuary comes in every 2 years and gives you a nice landscape of where things are. So they came in last, and at that point you were funded about 59.5% to your total liability. The liability will increase with the inflation rate of healthcare and the number of employees. On top of that, the assets have grown. The assets went from essentially 703,000 to 809 just since June. So you're now 68.4% funded off of the old liabilities, which again, those are moving a little bit, but you went from essentially high 50s to mid to high 60s just with the last market movement, which certainly helps. But it'd be a good question, and I don't know if you wanted more detail, but on the early retirement, that is definitely something, if you know, because the actuary is calculating this, your total liability off of retirement age eligibility. So if you were getting a lot of early retirements or expected them, you may want to have that discussion with the actuary, because they may want to run another
put the
plan.
batteries in, I'll pump it on.
Oops.
And that would, because they would adjust your liability. Your liability will go up if people will be taking money from the plan sooner. So obviously the funding ratio would go down, and there'd be more money that you would have to put in the plan to account for that, as to not deplete the fund.
And I know that, and I don't know if you've heard me, Kate was talking about doing an early retirement incentive. And I know 10 years was thrown out there. I don't know how true that is. Have you heard anything about that, and how would that affect us?
I didn't catch the first part of your question.
I know I've heard a lot about the state saying or coming out with an incentive of an early retirement. I know that different years have been turned, up, been different. Sometimes they say 5 years, sometimes they say 10 years. How would that affect us if, let's say we had 5 people who were getting towards retirement age and they decided to take that, and the state would pay them, let's say 10 years. How would that affect us?
Yes, similar to my last statement, I believe the essentially what would happen is the actuary would have to revalue the plan given the early retirements. So therefore, there'd be more funds going out sooner if they're eligible. And if they meet all the criteria to be paid out of what would be considered full retirement. And so therefore the full liability of the plan would increase, and there would be more money and more money needed to be contributed, or the fulfillment of the plan, meaning our assets meeting our liabilities, would go out further, meaning we'd have to get more aggressive with the portfolio.
Thank you.
I would just suggest at this point, maybe we can continue on with the rest of the presentation and then hold for some other questions at the very end.
Mhm.
Great.
Mary,
So
can I ask
Brian-
one quick question?
Oh, sure.
When we were talking about the trust agreement and the trustees and the board of OCPC being the trustees, I assume we mean the executive board and not all the delegates, right?
Ultimately, it's going to come down to you folks when you draft an actual trust. So my guess is yes, it's probably the executive board. You wouldn't want the whole board involved, but it can be either. Sure.
Okay, so Barbara, what I don't understand is if we don't have a trust agreement, how are we making decisions now as to managing the OPEB account?
Because the general law allows you to do it without a formal trust agreement. It's the actuary, when he's looking, and GASB 75 are now looking for that actual document. It's more to put the belt and suspenders around the OPEB planning.
Okay, thank you.
We'll move on to this
Great.
page, the portfolio.
Yeah, so from page 4, right now we're currently a balanced portfolio, which essentially means we essentially targeted as 45% fixed income and cash, 55% stock through time. So that's why this page is important. As we're a multi-decade event, how the performance is going to end up turning out like the long-term expected returns. This page makes sure that I'm not varying off course. And this is probably one of the more important pages. I know a lot of people want to talk about the most current things that are happening in portfolios, the most current numbers. But the real piece is that that we as managers stay on course to the investment policy statement that was agreed upon, and that we stay on target. So this is what it generally shows. You can see the fixed income currently at 41%, and we target 43. Our cash is in line at 2.2 versus 2. Sorry, that's at the top. I went out of order. And then the equity at 56.7 is just slightly above the 55% towards the bottom. So in line with our targets, and obviously if you think of where the markets have been happening with interest rates rising, which makes the fixed income values decline a little bit. And on the equities have really been running hot over the last back half of the year, certainly. And still increasing this year. That's why it's up a little bit more than the 55%. When it starts getting more towards the 60 is when we make sure we rebalance. Similarly to last year when equities really dropped, we made sure we want to make sure we rebalance to make sure that the stock bond is mixes there. And in line with, I guess, a couple of questions here. One, I think there was a previous question about would we taking short-term losses. We would take short-term gains, losses, long-term gains, losses. We're not a taxable entity, so we don't have to worry about the taxes. In general, it's just that if we rebalance in the beginning of a year and then you have a pandemic or assets move around a lot and then you rebalance, some items that you purchased more recently may get traded, which will cause more shorter term when normally everything we purchase is purchased in mind for a much longer term, but certainly in rebalancing, that's going to happen. The other part of that, and it's a very good question, it started out the first one, how often should we meet, to speak about the level of risk? Overall, the OPEB process, most people aren't, or most portfolios or trusts are not in the position you are. Most municipalities, even if they're AAA, are fighting to be in the teens or get to somewhere around 20% funded, never mind at your status. Those portfolios need, because the only way you can get money to grow this portfolio is either contributions or investment return. So many of those essentially have to go to be a more aggressive portfolio. And mostly, the pools out there, et cetera, are 75% stock and 25% bond. So we tell almost all plans that they have to, at some point, they're going to have to get there. It's the main part is if you have a funding plan or not, because sometimes, if you think of some of the towns that you all hail from, when they start that OPEB plan, it's almost like the town's hand is shaking, handing out that first 100,000, saying, "Hey, be careful with it," or even the first million. Be very careful in the markets with it. And if the market goes down, there's a lot. It's much more difficult to get the next contribution. And so you want to go several years sometimes, saying, okay, we're balanced, we all get how it is, we get buy-in around the process. And then as the markets move, we say, all right, we find that the maturation period usually about 3 to 5 years before people say, okay, now let's go to that 75-25 stock to bond to get the returns we need. So that's the normal process. With yourselves, if you continue with your funding, nice funding program, and you continue to get balanced returns at the current level of over, much over 50%, as I just said, 68% funded, you'll start getting close to your unfunded liability much sooner. So you have the ability to sustain where you are, or if you would like to get more aggressive, you'll get there faster, you'll just have a much bumpier road. And so I don't know if that was the hot part of it, or if people said, gee whiz, I don't like the risk, I would like to decrease it. The one problem with that is as you get more towards your liability, the liability is calculated on the long-term expected return of the asset allocation. Therefore, if you get more conservative, then the long-term expected return goes down, and therefore your liability goes up, and it'll take longer to achieve it. Conversely, obviously, you get more aggressive, the expected return goes higher, and the discount rate pulls that long-term liability down, and you will fulfill it sooner. Again, the bumpier ride. So it's the smoother the ride, the longer it's going to take to fulfill your goal of funding this, which then obviously allows for potentially early retirement or starting payouts out of this plan. So I went a good distance with that, but it's an important item that, as far as the when, we're happy to speak about it anytime with the Finance Committee or the whole board. But it's under that nature. We don't want to, if this is a multi-decade event, if you think about it, even if someone's retiring very soon, they're still going to live potentially several decades. So it's a multi-decade event. So we don't want to make changes to the asset allocation because of what we think the market's going to do. We want to do it in line with the funding goals of the plan, and that's where we including the actuary in the conversation helps too, because they're on board as well. They're not worried necessarily about the risks that may or may not be in front of the portfolio in the next year or two. They're worried about your funding goals, and being essentially meeting that liability for the long term.
Brian, if I could just interrupt. So for the council members at the finance meeting, this discussion came up as well. I reached out to Odyssey, Parker, and thank you. And just began the conversation about some of the discussions relating to that. So it's the right timing for having this discussion, as well as to be in concert and discussions with Odyssey.
And if to jump on that, thank you very much for that color. And if everyone understands actuary talk, which I didn't about 7 years ago until I started speaking to Parker and other actuaries quite often. With your permission, we are very happy to speak with them on either with you on the call or separately to talk to them if you want to outline questions of the best way to achieve your, again, your funding status and those same items as you talked about, retirement or any type of withdrawals from the fund, or same thing on the contribution side. So we're happy to do that. We find that it works, the plans work best when all stakeholders are on the same page, because of that same thing. If not, you start getting these circular loops. And I see the page moving, which is a great way to keep me moving. Thank you very much. On page 5, think of the portfolio and the performance of the portfolio. When we talk about our bottom line, is the top line for you right here. As I said, as of June 31st, 2020, the assets was $703,911 as analyzed from the actuary, and that 703 has turned into 809, as you see kind of in that numerically in the top left-hand corner. So very good return given the pandemic. Some people say, okay, I didn't realize that. I expected losses through here. It certainly was lumpy, but the back half of the year was surprising, I think, to most participants. So we don't hang a lot of on the last 3 months, but you can see positive, almost 3%, 296 for the last 3 months. The 8 months, well, yep, go right ahead, Becky.
I have 2 quick questions.
Sure.
Are we invested mostly in individual equities that you're selecting, or in equity funds?
Sure, we're in both bond and stock funds.
Okay, you guys aren't managing a portfolio with individual stock decisions.
We are doing that for the large cap stocks. So when you see large cap and in the portfolio under the holdings, it's BrightRock. So essentially we have a mutual fund, BrightRock, where we're picking those stocks. As this portfolio crosses $1 million, we'll break out the stocks and bonds probably separate. So we'd manage at that point the core fixed income and the core equity. After 2008, really, when our investment strategy outperformed really almost everything across the country, we started the BrightRock. So people, and think about the start of this when we first began it, with 55,000, was going to be hard to put bonds, all the diversification and individual stocks in there. So we put the funds in there, and we pick our own stocks within that fund. We rebate any fees, any investment fees, because we don't want to obviously double bill you on that. And that's so you get a similar ride to, or similar experience for portfolios that are, OPEB, a $10 million portfolio and an $800,000 portfolio can have a similar ride, a similar performance, and a similar outcome of returns.
Okay, and along the same lines, I know that Sandy had asked about insurance, and I understand the difference between what you were saying about cash versus stock and bonds and who sort of is behind each investment.
Yep.
When I think of the companies, obviously at this stage, we're not breaking out individual stocks and individual companies that are that we're assessing essentially the strength of when we look at our stock holdings. But do you have a policy in place for us that says no more than X percentage of our overall money will be invested in any individual company or any individual stock?
Yeah, great point, because that's always embedded. So we essentially try to hold those the funds that we invest to more to those points, because it's mutual fund. We don't have a mutual fund in here that has less than 30 securities in it. So they're all, and many of them have hundreds. The more, the way to think about it is when the more risky a market you go into, for the most part, the more securities you have. So in international portfolios is really set, sometimes it's several, well, I know there's not sometimes, there's several hundred securities, because of the fact that you're trying to get, be inclusive to many different countries, capitalization size of stocks, and obviously the different industries as well. So there's many items where you have it. That BrightRock I just mentioned, it tends to be more, of a kind of a 40 to 50 stock name. That's because it's blanketing 10 sectors within the U.S. economy at the large cap level, or the largest capitalized stocks in the marketplace. So therefore, rather than watering down every pick, we have several large names that are, like I said, the people really would know, and probably use most of the products for them, so we can have less names. Thank you. So just along that line, yeah, the most important thing, and then we can ask that is obviously the 1 year return inside the pandemic is almost 15.5%, 15.45. And then the long term of 3 years, 827, 5 year, 830, and the inception date, 660, are all higher than the discount rate that the actuary is using for your actuarial statement. So therefore, it's easy for them, and they still use the long-term expectations, so we'd be fine with that anyway. But your returns are certainly in line with everything that the actuary would be expecting out of this portfolio. Now, behind that, I know you guys have a long agenda.
Yes.
These are market slides. I was going to use these mostly as backup for any questions, comments, or anything anyone had. I do not have to go through them because they pertain really to what's going on out there as opposed to the makeup of the portfolio. We do have the holding.
Do you want to have some questions?
Yeah, we wanted to make sure we touched on obviously the OPEB process,
Yep.
How the portfolio stands, and we really wanted to answer those questions that the Finance Committee had. Please let us know if we have not to your satisfaction.
Investment in Apple.
Doug, do you have anything to say on behalf of the Finance Committee?
I have nothing. I think he answered all of our questions that we had. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah,
All right. You're welcome. Does anybody else have questions for either Brian or Barbara?
Question?
All right,
No.
doesn't sound like it. Sounds like everybody, we asked all of our questions. Yep, everybody looks good.
Madam President, I have a question.
Beautiful. All right, Charlie.
2 questions. One is, so if we're at 68% funded of the OPEB liability, how did you characterize that when compared to the majority of participants in such plans? Would you say we're ahead of the game?
It's ahead of really almost all general municipalities. It's much more, it's difficult for them they've started later, and it's most of those trail, or a couple that have kind of financed it ahead, a couple towns you might think of with some W's, etc. But most of them have not. The ones entities with the same or higher funding status of you or are kind of similar in nature. So, some of the collaboratives, electric plants where they're revenue producing, or as I say, collaboratives where you have multiple entities funding have multiple funding sources. So most of those, but yeah, as far as the towns and even highly rated ones, those tend to be a little bit behind, and for obvious reasons.
Thank you.
Very good.
All right, any other questions? All right, sounds like we got all of our questions answered, Brian. Thank you. Thank you
Great.
and Barbara very much for meeting with us and reviewing the OPEB. We appreciate your time and taking our questions ahead of time and tonight as well to answer all of our concerns.
Thank you for your time. Obviously, you already know the drill. If you have any to follow up, by all means, we'll let you guys move on. I know you got a full slate, but we appreciate your time. Sorry, I used to really enjoy going down to the building and sitting kind of around the circle of desks and chatting with everybody. So I look forward to doing that again, and I know Barbara does as well. And again, it looks like there's some new faces, so we look forward to that. Thank you. And again, anytime, reach out for any questions.
Thank you.